Good morning from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Now he's come around to fully embracing Bush's style to sell it. Confronted with his $5 trillion tax cut, which would skew towards the wealthy, Romney simply refused to own the consequences of his own proposal. And he used exactly the same share of taxes sleight of hand Bush got away with.
I'm not going to reduce the share of taxes paid by high-income people.
But Romney has an even more sophisticated game of three-card Monte than Bush had, with three principles that are impossible to satisfy together: lower tax rates for everyone, revenue neutrality, and taxes not being lowered on high-income people. But if you point to one of those cards, he waves at the other two. We've seen this before, and a lot of good folks got fooled the first time. So it's all the more true that those reporting on this campaign have a duty to make sure voters are not fooled again. We can start by listening to Romney himself.
We're going to cut taxes on everyone across the country by 20%, including the top 1%.
That was Mitt Romney before he found his inner Bush. But hear me now. If Mitt Romney is elected president, taxes for the top 1% will be reduced. If I had Mitt Romney's money, I'd even bet $10,000 on it. We'll see whether Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz or Romney advisor Avik want to take that bet when we come back. Morning. Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz is back with us, and I want to bring in Avik Roy, a member of Mitt Romney's Healthcare Policy Advisory Group, senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and author of The Apothecary, the Forbes blog on healthcare and social insurance reform, which I suggest you check out for, I think, one of the best takes from conservatives on that set of issues. So, do you want to take the bet? Anyone want to take the bet? My bet here is that taxes for the 1%, the wealthiest 1% of households in a Mitt Romney administration will go down.
Yeah, I'm not sure of that. So, I mean, I think some of the things that we've talked about and some things you talked about in your segment before, it's all about deductions, eliminating or limiting the deductions versus what you do to income tax rates. So there is a lot you can do with deductions, and the Tax Policy Center study, which gets a lot of play on this network and elsewhere, missed a few things. So there are other deductions that the TPC and Gail and the other co-authors of that study will even admit. You can get to revenue neutrality with the system that Romney's proposing, and that's what he insisted on the debate. And
you can get there, though, with some real political costs, which is going after deductions that people really care about, right? I mean, you can do things to charitable deductions. And, in fact, the president, in his first budget, proposed capping charitable deductions. And what happened was the entire world of universities, nonprofit hospitals, Catholic charities, everyone else freaked the heck out, and it got killed, right? You can go after the mortgage deduction. Well, good luck. Go around America and tell everyone that.
I don't think that we've heard any proposal from the Romney administration that would square these circles. You might do one or two of these, but not all three. In fact, I haven't heard anything that will really do the kinds of things that he says they'll do. And if I were to take up a bet, you look at where the Republican Party has been, as you said, I would if I had the money Romney had, I would be willing to take a bet that, in fact, we will see lower taxes for the top.
I want to ask you about this, because this strikes me as something that liberals think a lot about capital gains, particularly this one loophole called carried interest, right? Carried interest is a way in which particularly fund managers can declare the income they derive from managing the funds, which looks to all of us like essentially their income, their wages, as a capital gains benefit, and pay a 15% rate. And that's a loophole that's been preserved, I should note, by Democrats and Republicans. Chuck Schumer has seemed to do some work behind the scenes to make sure that's carried through. It's also been criticized by both sides. Rupert Murdoch, I remember tweeting earlier this year, that he was criticizing carried interest. Is that the kind of thing that you or the brain trust around Romney would like to see that kind of loophole closed?
Well, see, so the carried interest, I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think what it raises for the government is something like $15 billion or $4 billion. It's some tiny number that really doesn't do much. So I can understand that there's a lot of equity or egalitarianism issues with it, but fiscally it's not that consequential.
But the capital gains tax overall is very significant.
What's interesting is that the Wall Street Journal editorial page is constantly complaining that Mitt Romney isn't aggressive enough about cutting capital gains tax. They want him to cut capital gains. That hasn't been a focus.
Paul Ryan gets rid of capital gains tax taxes in his first budget.
But Mitt Romney
that
doesn't.
distort the economy?
Mitt Romney doesn't. His focus is on lowering income tax rates, which a lot of small businesses also pay, and lowering the deductions or limiting the itemized deductions that create a lot of problems in the tax code.
Let me grant you the maximal amount of good faith to Mitt Romney for a second. Okay, let me say that he really is committed to revenue neutrality. He really is committed to not reducing taxes on the highest income. Now, I don't believe that, but let's grant it for the moment. He said this thing in the debate, which I thought was right. He said, look, none of this is just passed by the president by himself. You have a dialogue with the legislature. And you just cannot credibly tell me, sitting at this table, that a tax bill that comes out of this House Republican caucus, they're going to let a bill get out of that House without cuts for the top, elimination of the estate tax, which is actually explicitly advocated by the Romney campaign, all sorts of other ways in which taxes are going to be reduced to the top. That is in their DNA. It's what they're committed to ideologically. It's what their record is doing. I just can't see it being the case.
Yeah, so I completely disagree with that. So I think the orthodoxy of the conservative movement on taxes is simplification. So lower the rates, but also get rid of the Swiss cheese of all these deductions. Make the code simpler.
But let's talk about what the orthodoxy. What's the orthodoxy and what's the reality? There's an actual governing record of the Republican Party over the last 10 years, which has not been, I'm sorry to tell you, simplification. In fact, it has been punching Swiss cheese loopholes in the code and reducing things at the top. In fact, the only consistent theme of the actual Republican Party record is reducing the burden of high-income earners in taxes. It has not been simplification.
And I think there are lots of other distortions that need to be addressed. A proposal to take away the estate tax would increase the plutocracy, the inherited plutocracy of our society. People like Warren Buffett has said that's wrong.
Right. Yes,
and I'd like to hear Romney say, I think it's wrong. In fact, he's doing everything to avoid paying the taxes to create a new plutocracy.
There's a fairness argument in the other direction. So an immigrant who comes to this country and builds a small business all on his own with the hard work of himself.
Nobody creates everything on their own.
They take advantage there are the roads and the post office and all that.
And they take advantage of our educated population that comes from our public schools. Nobody does it on their own. That rhetoric is a really destructive one.
Wait a minute, though. So, like, if they build that business on their own, or whatever you want to call it, I mean,
in concert with the flourishing that is American society,
and the flourishing of American society and the community and all those great things that we all love.
You don't believe
once that person dies, oftentimes because of the estate tax, he has to sell that business instead of passing it on to his children.
Oftentimes, though, there's a tiny incidence.
The percentage of these people is negligible, and we've actually put provisions in our tax code to allow people to spread that over, say in the case of farms, over 14, 15 years. And we could do more. I mean, I can understand for that very small number for which that's a problem, we have ways of handling that does not force the sale.
But Joe actually brings up a question which I'd like to hear, which is to say, okay, let's say, so I'm a liberal, or I'm a skeptical egalitarian. Let's say I'm one of those people that I mentioned in the polls in the story of the week in the last hour, who's just who doesn't have a big ideological commitment. But I do think there's the equity argument makes sense to me. I think the rich are paying too little in taxes. I'd like to see that go up.
Okay.
You could choose an issue if you were Mitt Romney. You can just choose one, say carried interest, right, which isn't a lot of money. But you can say, you know what, you're right, there are some real inequalities in our tax code, and I'm going to go after carried interest, or I'm going to go after tax havens, or I'm going to preserve the estate tax, because you could choose some kind of egalitarian issue, but there's nothing on the table that he's chosen.
But Chris, you're saying two different things that are contradicting each other. So you're saying that when he wants to limit the deductions, well, he's not going to do that because Congress will never pass it. But then you're saying, well, he's not advocating anything that limits, that increases taxes or increases revenues on the rich. That's precisely what limiting these deductions do, because they're regressive deductions.
Well, but also let's say he hasn't look. If the thing that was on the table was explicitly limiting deductions, we had a plan that proposed limiting deductions, we could debate that. He's sort of hand waved in the direction of limiting deductions as one possible way that he might be able to make the math work. But of course, what's convenient about that is that no one can. It's like nailing Jello to the wall. You can't actually debate the plan because we don't know what that looks like.
So a number of people in the think tank world have have, again, assessed this Tax Policy Center report, which claims that there's an $85 billion shortfall, that if you use Romney's plan, that $85 billion is left over that he can't make up with the deductions or whatever the Tax Policy Center accounts for, and that the middle class will have to pay higher taxes as a result. And first of all, Romney has said the middle class will not pay higher taxes. That's a core pledge of his plan. But secondly, there are a number of things that the Tax Policy Center didn't consider that amount to about $150 to $200 billion in extra revenue that would fall on people with incomes over $200,000 a year.
As we've been discussing, Mitt Romney consistently tried to tack to the president's left on issues like health care, housing, and entitlements in this week's debate. But Romney's conversion was especially disingenuous on the subject of Wall Street reform. Romney complained that nearly 2 years after the passage of Dodd-Frank, key federal agencies have yet to promulgate some of the bedrock regulations at the heart of the president's signature financial reform. He highlighted mortgage regulation in particular.
Dodd-Frank correctly says we need to have qualified mortgages, and if you give a mortgage that's not qualified, there are big penalties. Except they didn't ever go on to define what a qualified mortgage was. It's been 2 years. We don't know what a qualified mortgage is yet. So banks are reluctant to make loans, mortgages. Try and get a mortgage these days. It's hurt the housing market because Dodd-Frank didn't anticipate putting in place the kinds of regulations you have to have. It's not that Dodd-Frank always was wrong with too much regulation. Sometimes they didn't come out with the clear regulation.
Republicans have tried to pull off this thing, and Mitt Romney was doing it in the debate, where he's kind of appropriating the left critique of Dodd-Frank as not going far enough in service of essentially defending deregulation and the status quo. Here's one example of this. This is Mitt Romney claiming that Dodd-Frank enshrines the principle of too big to fail. Take a look.
Dodd-Frank was passed, and it includes within it a number of provisions that I think has some unintended consequences that are harmful to the economy. One is it designates a number of banks as too big to fail, and they're effectively guaranteed by the federal government. This is the biggest kiss that's been given to New York banks I've ever seen. This is an enormous boon for them.
What he's talking about specifically is a designation of a bank as a systemically important financial institution, or SIFI. And the fact of the matter is, if it's a big wet kiss, the banks have not been told that because they have been spending unbelievable amounts of money, fighting tooth, nail, and claw, and lobbying behind the scenes not to be designated as a systemically important financial institution, precisely because it comes with additional regulations.
What he should have said, and I would have welcomed that, is to say, let's break up these banks.
Yes.
Now, that would have been a real turn to the left of Romney. And I think we would all say that would be a move in the right direction. But to say and to pretend that they are not too big to fail, you're not going to add the kind of regulation, and we're just going to let them be, is putting us back in the state where we were in 2007, where we know what we will do.
Avik, would you like to see the breakup of the too big to fail?
So I don't speak for the Romney campaign on any issue, and certainly not on banking regulation. But personally, yes, I think that the real problem here is the banks are too big. That's why they're too big to fail. So there's certain things that you can do to do that. The capital requirements are toothless. Capital requirements actually constrain banks, and they're very hard for regulators to see what banks actually own. So
Mitt Romney endorsed capital requirements in the debate. I should know.
No, capital requirements. It's important to have capital requirements, but they have to be really thought through on. They're not like, Basel III is a complete disaster.
Okay, wait. Before we get into Basel III, let me just explain very quickly what capital requirements are, because that seems like a necessary part of this, right? The question is, banks obviously, the nature of being a bank is that you lend more money than you have sitting around at any one moment. That is how a bank works, right? So the question is, what is that? How much money do you have to have sitting around? That's essentially what a capital requirement is. How much has to be sitting there so that if something terrible happens and someone comes to you and says, you owe us $7 billion, you need to write a $7 billion check, you can go into the capital that you have on hand, you can write that check and not suddenly be insolvent. That's what capital requirements are.
But if the banks went back to responsible lending, where if they give a loan, they keep skin in the game, we all know that's the direction we want to go. That's the direction the banks should want to go if they were going to rely on no bailout.
Right. I mean, the biggest problem with Dodd-Frank, the real critique from the conservative point of view, is really this issue of too big to fail, that it enshrines too big to fail, because these systemically important institutions now have, I understand there's regulations around how they manage their businesses, which they don't like, but at the other end of the spectrum, they have a competitive advantage against smaller banks.
But enshrines is such a weird word, because too big to fail was the actual truth of the matter. So you can't say it enshrines it unless there's an alternative to get rid of it. Getting rid of it, which is breaking up the big banks, which you favor, there was a Democratic proposal to limit bank size. It was called Brown-Kaufman. It was sponsored by Sherrod Brown and Ted Kaufman from Delaware, and it was defeated largely by the Republicans in the Senate who filibustered.
And let me make an important point. There are a number of ways of limiting, so we shouldn't get down, bogged down in the particular way. The point is, if Romney came out and said, I want to limit the size, let's have a good discussion about the best way of doing it, I would feel a lot better.
Jeff Connaughton, who worked with Senator Ted Kaufman, Delaware senator, who was one of the people that proposed essentially breaking up the too big to fail banks with Sherrod Brown and Brown-Kaufman, tweets me to make the point, which is a good point, which is that the Obama administration opposed Brown-Kaufman. We should be very clear, and a lot of Democratic senators did. So this wasn't entirely at all a partisan thing. In fact, it came up against a lot of resistance in both parties to break up the big banks. Now, I want to find out what my guests know now they didn't know when the week began. Pick up Avik Roy.
This week we learned that Miguel Cabrera is one of the greatest hitters in the history of baseball.
He achieved a
Triple Crown, one of the first player in 45 years to lead a league, one of the two major leagues, in batting average, home runs, and runs batted in. Incredible accomplishment. So congratulations to Miguel Cabrera, and go Tigers.
All right. Well, all the sabermetric heads out there are tissing the triple town because RBI are no longer seen as quite the hot statistic that they once were. My thanks to Alexis Goldstein from Occupy Wall Street, Diedrich Mohammed of the NAACP, Nobel Prize winning economist Joseph Stiglitz. The book is The Price of Inequality, and Avik Roy. Always great to have you here, advisor to Mitt Romney. Thank you for getting up.
Everybody stay put.